being inside because, days like today, they're kind of rare in New England winters. It's my pleasure to welcome Bob Frishman back in our midst. While most members familiar with Bob and his work, they think of him as the clock guy, at least I do, who has repaired and sold and written about hundreds, and no, actually thousands of clocks, maybe 10,000? Eight. Okay. Amazing. He's been in the horology business for a quarter of a century, just about. He joins us today to talk not specifically about clocks, but about the world of Rufus Porter, a New England muralist that you've probably all heard of, which is why you're here. But he was so much more. I felt like such a dummy when I went up to the Rufus Porter Museum in Bridgeton, Maine, with my friend Elaine Tarbox, who has a summer home up there. It was delightful. And we walked out and thought, we didn't know all this about him. He's just an amazing person. He's a scientist beyond being an artist. There is a clock connection between Bob and Rufus Porter, and you'll be hearing about that in just a moment. So without further blah blah from me, please welcome our friend and today's speaker, Bob Frishman.
Get that rubber band dropped. Thank you, Diane. And I should also thank Bill Lundbergen. There would be no way I would be standing here without our conversations over the years about the Salem Athenaeum. And whenever he came to my house to bring a clock for me to fix, we ended up talking about the Salem Athenaeum. And finally I said, that's the kind of place I should belong and do things with. So thank you, Bill, for being my guide to this wonderful place too. And thank, of course, all of you for this matinee performance too. I know my wife and I like to go to the theater at night. It feels weird to come out of something and it still be light out, but this is the matinee, and we'll consider it that and go with the flow. So I also made the mistake today of sort of boning up a little bit more on this subject, even though I've been working on the talk for several days during the week. But I realized I need about 8 hours. So I hope you don't mind. We'll wrap it up around midnight probably with the final slide, but we'll work on the way here too. So as you'll hear, this is somewhat different for me because normally I'm speaking only about clocks or perhaps about artworks that have clocks in them, as I did last weekend at my town library, where I have an exhibit of paintings and prints that have clocks and watches in them. But this is about Rufus Porter, and you'll hear kind of why Rufus Porter grabbed me with the bear trap and didn't let go. So I suppose we should see what he looks like. This is the only known image of him taken late in life. But you see that he lived a very long time, and as you hear, he had a second wife who was much younger than he was, and one of his 15 kids actually lived until the 1940s. So for somebody born in 1792, I guess his DNA had a lot of reach to it. So he's often referred to as a polymath, and I think that's a good way to describe him. This is a book about polymaths. I tried to return it when Rufus Porter's name wasn't in it, but anyway, I still own it. But just to deal with that theme of how he truly was one. Sometimes he's been called the New England Leonardo da Vinci because he really had such wide-ranging interests and abilities with what he was doing. So probably my first exposure to Rufus Porter, which I have to say didn't stick, was this house in Andover, belonged to my childhood pediatrician, Dr. Dick Katz. And as I then became a clock repairer when I no longer was 6 years old, he asked me to come over and work on some of his clocks. And he said, by the way, we have Rufus Porter murals in our house. And it was like, oh, great. And, and I looked at them and I thought they were interesting, but it made really no impression on me at the time. So it needed more of a hook at that time, but I realize now I wish I'd paid more attention. And I hope that those are still there. The house has changed hands a couple of times. Dr. Katz isn't with us any longer, but let's hope that the murals have remained there. But this is what got me into this because, and you'll hear more of a specific description about this clock. But I owned this clock for a while. It's the only known clock of any kind that has Rufus Porter's name on it. And it's one, again, that I owned until I decided it should be at the Rufus Porter Museum that Diane and her friend visited last summer. And that's where it is now. I have plenty of other clocks that immediately filled that spot in my foyer. So you don't have to feel sorry for me that I, emptied my house to do this. That was not an issue at all. So another place where I did see Rufus Porter and art and it made more of an impact on me was the Museum of Fine Arts, where there's a room there where they have wall panels that have come from one of the many demolished Rufus Porter mural houses. I think at the latest count, there's almost 200 that were known to have Rufus Porter murals in them. Probably fewer than 100 still exist that haven't been demolished or burnt down or had the wallpapered over or painted over or whatever. So occasionally the walls are saved. They're actually removed from the house before it's torn down, and they are saved. And this is the example that the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston owns, and it gives you a sense of the proportion and of what they look like as well. And there's a little close-up which starts to talk about the distinctive natures of the Rufus Porter murals and artwork, because they were fairly standard in what he did. He did them quickly, and we'll talk about that. And this sort of boxy shape house is typical. He used a lot of stencils and he did things quickly. So they're recognizable for that reason too, because they're sort of distinctive if you're trying to attribute artworks to and murals to Rufus Porter. Even though one of the early books that I'll mention is by Jean Lippman, who wrote about him in the 50s and then in the 70s. And then the people who have written about him more recently said she sort of got overexcited about attributing a lot of murals to Rufus Porter, which maybe aren't by him. But one of the attractions of the murals, and the reason they became so popular and were around a lot, was because they were an inexpensive alternative to wallpaper. So at the time he was doing this, which was in the 1810s, the 1820s, the alternative was either to paint the wall if with some basic color, or if you were affluent, you would have mostly imported and then later American wallpapers, colorful wallpapers. But again, they were far more expensive. They were fragile. They could peel off or be damaged. And as I read today too, often it was a nice hiding place for insects, would be behind the wallpaper. So it wasn't that great, maybe for a lot of reasons, to have wallpaper, but Rufus Porter merchandised his mural painting abilities as an alternative to this expensive wallpaper. Another place where I was able to see Rufus Porter murals on the walls is at this antique house in Rocks Village in Haverhill, Massachusetts, where my friend Damon lives right around the corner from there. And this was right across the street from a longtime clock repair customer of mine named Fred MacArthur. And once he knew that I was interested in Rufus Porter, and he saw my Rufus Porter clock, he allowed me to gain admission to this house, which is sort of floor to ceiling, 2 floors of some of the best preserved, beautiful Rufus Porter murals. I wasn't able to take a lot of pictures in the house. It was their house, and I think they didn't really want me to, but I did snap this picture. This is on the stairs going up to the 2nd floor. So here's one of Rufus Porter's little horses that's, going upstairs. I didn't tilt the picture. That's actually the angle on which it was painted. And this was a common thing for Rufus. If he was doing 2 stores and going up a staircase, he could have an angled sort of an uphill scene climbing those stairs as well. So there have been people who kind of brought Rufus Porter out of obscurity. And one of the earliest ones with Nina Fletcher Little who was well known as as an American folk art collector, early American furniture collector, and she did this book about American decorative wall painting, and she did have some examples. She discovered some examples and put them in her book. This is Cogswell Grant, one of the historic New England houses in New England where she lived, and it's now a historic New England property which you can visit. There's Nina and Bert Little. She would, travel around and buy a lot of antiques if she could, and had an amazing collection. This is a view of her little cubby hole where she did a lot of her writing. She did articles for Antiques Magazine and other places about the subject. She was one of really the pioneers in appreciating and documenting American folk art of all kinds. And you can see she did have kind of a large Rufus Porter portrait there, and she got very interested in them. At the time, again, I'm confessing here, I took the picture because of the clock on the wall, not because of the Rufus Porter portrait, but fortunately, it was in the picture when I circled back and realized that she was instrumental in Rufus Porter. Her collection was sold at Sotheby's in the 1980s. And these are a page of several of the items that she owned. She owned original Rufus Porter things, and we'll see a few of them as we go along too. But she owned some interesting, rare Rufus Porter things, and this is the auction listing at that time. This is another place out in Townsend, near Pepperell. That is a house that's full of Rufus Porter murals. And I did a talk there about Rufus Porter, and they did allow me to take pictures in there. And here you get the sense of what it was like. Usually it was all encompassing. It was all four walls of a room, floor to ceiling. And he had very specific concepts of how to create these murals. And he published actually guides to how people could do this. And he would essentially say, you draw a line halfway up, and that's, kind of where the horizon is, and you'd make big trees in the front, and he told you sort of how tall to make those as opposed to the ones in the back, so you would have perspective and get a feeling about the distance involved. So it's really quite powerful when you see this. And these are in a good state of preservation, but still understanding that they were much more vivid and bright when they were first painted. And there's a close-up of one of the walls too, where he just had these distinctive scenes. And the key thing here, as we start to look at these more, is that he was certainly not an academic painter. He was not a trained artist, and he didn't want to be. And he often wrote about, in kind of advance of abstraction and impressionism, that he was more interested in sort of conveying the feeling of the scene. He was not trying to be an academic painter where, you couldn't tell if it was real or not, and every hair of somebody's head was perfectly defined. He wanted to create the sense of the feel and environment of the scene he was creating. And he wanted you to kind of walk into this room and feel like you were outside, that you were, enjoying this vista of New England particularly too. And it's interesting because for a long time, people didn't know who had done these murals at all. It wasn't really until the 50s when they understood it better. And there were all these tales about how it must have been like some English prisoner of war, after the Revolution, the War of 1812, and he got out and he roamed around and painted these scenes. But there's nothing artistic, there's nothing European about these at all. These are, distinctly Rufus Porter, distinctly American art that's groundbreaking in a way. So there's another view that's in there, and I show this because this is the light in Portland, Maine, and he spent a lot of his youth in Portland. His backstory a little bit is that he was born in West Boxford in 1792. Didn't have much education, passed about the 6th grade, and he was, hanging around the house too much, and his parents tried to apprentice him to his older brother, who was a shoemaker. And that didn't last very long, about 3 months, and he ran away the same way that Ben Franklin ran away from his printer brother, who he was apprenticed with and was not having a good time. So Rufus Porter essentially ran away to Portland, Maine, where he became a musician, a violinist, a fife and drum instructor, a dance instructor, and he also learned how to do house painting and sign painting, which is what got him into this, but if we look at this tower, the reason I have that here is because other artists have painted this. This is a painting by Charles Codman. It's a little bit later in the 19th century. And there's a wonderful book of poetry that I have here by Wesley McNair, who we see here. And he was inspired to write a couple of poems that referred to Rufus Porter. And he even, he's dedicated this to Gene Lippmann, who is the one who really did the first comprehensive biography of Rufus Porter. And I won't read this all there, but he's kind of channeling Rufus Porter, and they're looking up past the roof. I found that goddamn tower. Lord, what a sight. A flag calmly unwrapping. So you're all welcome to read the rest of the poem or enjoy his Wesley McNair's poetry, but he was inspirational to poets too, who were trying to honor and channel this amazing polymath and artist at the time that this was written. And there's the tower now. It's still there. If you visit Portland, Maine, you can see that it's still there. And it had an innovative system when it was built of flags up here, which would alert merchants, local merchants, that their ships were arriving from overseas or from down south or wherever. So each of the local merchants had their own little pennant. And if the guy in the top there with binoculars saw that merchant ship coming into Portland Harbor, he would raise the pennant and the merchant would know that his stuff was on the way. You also could see Mount Washington from here as well on a clear day with binoculars. So it's 70 miles away in the White Mountains. So it's a significant landmark, and it was one clearly burned into Rufus Porter's head because he used it in a lot of his murals. So what he did for a lot of his younger years was he was an itinerant artist, where he would go both to towns and villages and cities, not only to paint wall murals, but to do portraits of people. And he had a way of doing them very quickly and inexpensively, because the alternatives were little professionally, artistically painted miniatures, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that often were watercolor on ivory or sometimes watercolor on paper, but they were still quite expensive and they were, very clear in them. But he had a quick way of doing these and producing them inexpensively. So this is just a painting by William Byrd King from a similar time period, showing an itinerant painter who's again gone place to place to do portraits of the families that are there. So as I'll mention again, and there's a book here related to this, there was a wonderful exhibit about Rufus Porter at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art that was a couple of years ago. And included in that exhibit was a painting set and a stenciling set that's not Rufus Porter's, but it's quite similar to what he had. This is also in the collection of Historic New England. So this is the kind of box and supplies that he would be carrying town to town. He had a little wagon at one point with a little flag on it, brightly decorated. So when he came to town, people knew it and got excited about it. And they could either have their house walls painted, murals for maybe $6, $8, as opposed to wallpaper that would cost twice that. And also perhaps even simultaneously do little portraits of the people that were there. And one of the important things about him being a polymath and what was happening in New England at that time was the whole existence and life of taverns, because these were the places where all these itinerants, they were peddlers. It was something that young men did after the War of 1812, where they would travel around the country selling things, learning things, selling their services. And they would end up at these taverns at night where they would sit around, until the wee hours, not only exchanging, world news, but talking about what they were doing, what they were selling, what they were inventing. Because a lot of their customers were the Yankee farmers who were already, good at kind of figuring out how to do stuff on their own. But if, Rufus Porter came along and said, hey, I just designed this thing that will actually keep your axe handle from flying off when you're chopping a tree down, they would be interested and he could sell them. So these were kind of instrumental to the kind of rural industrialization of Northeast New England America. which was different than what was happening in the cities. You know, you think, well, the cities must be where there were the factories and all these mechanics were together inventing stuff, thinking stuff up. But a lot of it in the New England history was happening rurally because of all this cross-fertilization of these roving people like Rufus Porter, who were swapping ideas and learning as they went along and learning what people wanted and what they would buy, which was also the big point of it was labor saving, was to try to make tools better, systems better, so that these people wouldn't have to work quite as hard as they did. He had to work on his family farm before they farmed him out to be a cobbler. And I think he probably realized that, you know, there were probably ways to make all that work easier. So if we start looking at the Rufus Porter portraits, again, these are small and I happen to have an original. So I bought this at one point, which you're all welcome to look at, because this is basically what they were. The cool thing about this, as you'll see, is that there's information on the back about it. So, and he was able to do, again, these quickly, and you'll hear how we did that. I've been plagued now by the shape of his little ear thing there, because at the opening of the Rufus Porter exhibit at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, a friend was there, Deb Child, who wrote the exhibit catalog chapter about Rufus Porter miniature portraits. And as my wife Jean will confirm, and I brought this along to show, look, I have this nice Rufus Porter miniature, and Deb like pulled Jean aside and went, Jane, I got something, you know, very, I hope you're not, something very serious to tell you. He said, God, you know, is Bob having a heart attack? You know, what's happening? He said, I don't really think that that's a Porter. I don't think that's a Rufus Porter. And I mean, in a way, I don't really care anyway. It's a beautiful little thing. But he said, when he did that little circle in his ear, it didn't look like that. So, you know, whether, you know, and Rufus Porter, there's probably 100 and some Rufus Porter miniature portraits like this known. 4 of them are signed and attributed to Rufus Porter. But somehow Deb has assigned Rufus Porter attribution to the other 100 too. And I mean, she's not here, so I can say whatever I want, I guess. But I'm just a little skeptical if she was attributing the other 100 to like the C-shaped curve of his earlobe. You know, maybe I shouldn't worry too much. I mean, when I bought this at auction, it was identified as a Rufus Porter miniature. And, you know, so that's fine with me. And if it's not, you know, I'll take my chances that, you know, when I go to sell it someday, that maybe they'll say, oh, that can't be a Porter. But as you'll see, it looks a heck of a lot like the others. So this is what's on the back. This was actually a label from probably a dealer who sold the frame, but down here it identifies the sitter, and that's unusual. But it does say who this was and where he was at the time. So that was a good thing. So Rufus Porter would come into town and he would advertise in the local paper. And this was encased in Haverhill, Massachusetts, not far from here in 1821. You know, he would advertise that there he will be, and he can do full colors for a couple of dollars, and he'll be there longer. And often he said this, no likeness, no pay. So if you don't think that looked like you, I guess, you know, he doesn't collect the money. I don't know how many people complained and, you know, what happened, but that was kind of his guarantee that you probably will be happy with it. And this is another ad as well. Again, correct likenesses taken with elegance and dispatch. And here's, you know, the array. So if you just wanted one of those cheapo ones where he essentially would do an outline and fill in the colors, you know, for as little as 20 cents, when a little artist generated portrait of a miniature on ivory, you know, it'd be many dollars. So here, you know, side view with colors, front views. But if you wanted one, he was able to do it. He said he could do it on ivory for $8. So again, this is one of the few known ads that we still have related to him. The reason he was able to do these this quickly is because he knew about and eventually created and built his own camera obscura, which allowed him very quickly to point this at the sitter, and then on it with a mirror system and paper inside the box, he could quickly trace the profile, the outline of the person's face. And then he was able to fill it in. And supposedly within 10 or 15 minutes, he could hand you the finished product. And that was one reason why it was 20 cents, was he wasn't starting from scratch. And, he got the profile perfectly because it was there inside the camera obscura. So, again, he built this. This is an earlier one, that came from Philadelphia, but it would have looked quite like this. And this is what he carried around. So we'll see a few more, again, that I think this one, the ear was right for Deaf Child. So, this is attributed, and again, we'll just show you a few more. He also certainly was capable of doing likenesses where he didn't use the camera obscura, and you'll see some of those too, but they aren't profiles. And, he was certainly competent to create a likeness, but I guess the ones that the people didn't like got thrown out, so we don't see the bad ones. We only see the ones. So, yeah, he could do full portraits like this as well. So this certainly is a larger Rufus Porter. They think he probably also grain painted the oval case that it was in as well. And here's a cute little miniature watercolor of a little girl who's identified as well. I think kids had bigger heads back then than they do now, and bigger arms maybe. So, maybe his perspective wasn't perfect, but evidently this was a good enough likeness because they probably paid for it and kept it. The other thing that he produced were these family registers where he designed it and then was engraved and printed by somebody else. But this was something that was designed and produced by Rufus Porter. So he was making an effort, to commercialize things. He didn't want to just do one-offs. He was trying to support himself and his family. The other thing that he produced were books about this. He was a sharer, I guess all that time in the taverns telling it. He wanted people to know how to do all this kinds of stuff. And he produced this book, which went through, I think, 5 more editions. It was popular. And some of it was cribbed from an English book that was like that, but it was how to do all kinds of things. It was basically for amateurs, so they could do artistic things, but other kinds of fun things as well. So here's from the page of contents that's has more pages than this. So these are good here: to light a candle with ice, freeze water, change the color of animals. You could procure an exhilarating gas. So all of these are little descriptions, and that book is back there too in a replica form. So if you want to change the color of your dog, you'll see the instructions for how to do that. So again, that was a popular thing. Other people did this as well. But as you'll see too, all his life he was an educator, a teacher, as well as being an artist and what he got into his invention. So this is the American Antiquarian Society where I went and found and read all of the newspapers that he began to produce. He was the first one in America to produce kind of science and mechanics oriented journalism. And this was beginning in 1842, the American Mechanic. So every week he would produce things that had patent applications for that period, often indications of things that he was inventing, like this oddball rowing machine here too. So, but there had not existed this kind of newspaper before that was specifically for people who wanted to learn how to make stuff and what new inventions there were. So this was really a precursor to many other similar things that came later. But part of his problem, he was a bad businessman. He was very impulsive, and he'd work on something quickly and then give it up and go do something else, which I guess makes him a polymath, but also means that he never got rich off anything because he would design something, sell it to somebody who commercialized it and move on. And that was the case with a lot of what he did here. But one of his claims to fame, which now has made him perhaps more prominent, is that he was the originator of Scientific American, which is the oldest continuous publication, kind of technical scientific magazine journal in America. And he was the founder of this. He was the first editor of it. After some months, he got a little tired of it, but even worse, the building that his offices were in burnt down. And he saved his subscription list, but he lost enough other stuff that he couldn't sustain it financially. And he sold it to guys that he'd been working with. And they were the ones that kind of continued it on. And it, as we know, Scientific American is still one of the most prominent technical journals in America today. So he's famous for that. But these early issues of the Mechanics and then the Scientific American magazines, they're all there in their original forms at the American Antiquarian Society. So I was able to sit there for a couple of days, not on microfilm or going blind with, microfiche or something. I was actually turning the pages of this year's worth, or a couple of years worth of Rufus Porter things. And it's just full of great stuff in there, that people like me that, liked early mechanical stuff was good. So when he founded Scientific American, this was his opening sort of front page editorial about why he was doing it. And you see I've underlined here that this is what he's focusing on and hoping that people will appreciate and subscribe. And they did, but this is kind of his explaining why he was founding the magazine. So they would have, little things like this. This again was another one of his inventions. Anybody in physics would know that this would never work. But it's a great idea. Yeah. How about if we just, use the wind to power the side paddles of the boat? I guess if you don't think about, sort of loss of energy issues and all that, yeah, that's a great idea. The wind will turn the blades and then turn the paddle wheels. So most of these things were never built, were never commercialized, but some were, including his revolver, which he, well before Samuel Colt, he conceived of like a 6-shooter revolving pistol and rifle. And Samuel Colt bought that idea from him for $100. And Colt, of course, then went on to be a billionaire in those dollars, I guess. But that was, at least the Rufus Porter enthusiasts say that was a Rufus Porter invention, and it seems quite believable. Of course, the Scientific American continued, and one of my favorite issues back from the 1880s was where they visited the Waltham Watch Factory and did a multi-page special issue about everything that happened in the Waltham Watch Factory. So this is a wonderful resource for people that are interested in watchmaking history in America. And that was a pivotal time too in the American Industrial Revolution, because the Swiss were still making watches pretty much by hand, even though they were making a ton of them. But this was the first factory really that made watch parts by machine. So the invention, the main attributes of this was that they invented the machines that could make the watches. And then they could spit out, thousands of watch parts that would have taken individual craftsmen, days to make. So this was certainly an appropriate subject for Scientific American to be covering about how they were able to do this. Of course, there were plenty of people working the machines, including women that were 40% of the workforce at the Waltham Watch Factory, and they were being paid the same amount as the male workers who were doing the same job. So it was a very good place for women to work, and a progressive place as well. This is another invention of Rufus Porter's. It was a revolving almanac that would allow you to know, like, 4,000 years ago what day of the week your birthday was, or 4,000 years from now, as we bought. So there were like 3 layers of paper that could rotate, and you could zero in on dates and calendar dates and all that. This was actually pretty popular. A number of them were made and sold, even though they were kind of ridiculed too by people who were writing about it, saying, do I really need to know what day of the week my birthday was back before Christ was walking around? Maybe not. But this is a description of the revolving almanac. This is from his newspaper when he was promoting that. So you can see it's a calculation for 800 years and extending more than 6,000 into the future. So all that. So I'll be printing up some of those and selling them after the talk here today. Yeah. One of the other things he did was his inclinometer. It's basically a level, and he was promoting it particularly for masons who were building walls, and also to make sure that once they were laying brick or laying stone, that they would be keeping it level. So this piece could just sit on that wall, and this was a weighted indicator. So if this was tilted, it would show that they needed to straighten things up to get this pointing right up at 0 up at the top. So now we're talking about how I ended up with all this, and I went to this Skinner auction some years ago down when they were in Bolton before they moved to Marblehead, and this is the auction catalog that I carried in there with me, and I saw this clock that said Rufus Porter Billerica, and I had this little ding in my head, Rufus Porter, yeah, I think he's the guy that did those murals that I don't care about, but Billerica, now you're talking, because that's almost the next town from Andover, so I would have a great local clock. I'd have a clock that was made very close to Andover. So that's why I started to bid on it. And that's why one other guy was bidding against me, and I turned and gave him a bad look, and he quit. And I was able to buy this Rufus Porter clock and start down this incredible, wormhole of standing here today talking about Rufus Porter. But at that time, it meant almost nothing to me except that it was a pretty clock and it said Billerica on it. So of course I had to go to Billerica and find out. So this is an early view of the town of Billerica, again, quite close to me. And this is a view of the church tower that's still there and in that town. So I went and we know we're in Billerica because of that. So we're there. And this is where not Rufus Porter, but Rufus Porter's first wife is buried there. So here is Eunice Porter. She died at age 54. Again, as I mentioned, he then married a much younger woman and had 5 more kids after Eunice had 10 with him. And then you kind of wonder how they managed that, because Rufus Porter was itinerant and he wasn't home that much. But I guess he was home at least 10 times because he had, we know of the 10 kids he had, and 2 of his sons are buried there as well. So this is one of his sons there right next to mom. And then another son is there, Washington Irving Porter is buried there as well. Some of them didn't live as long as others, but you can visit at least some of the Porter family there. So here's the auction listing for that Porter clock too, that again, once I saw the clock, I said, maybe I better read up on it and see what I might be buying. And there it was. This is a Skinner auction preview, where the clocks are lined up and you can decide which ones you want to get the second mortgage on your house for to buy. So I'm sure nobody here is interested in antique clocks, right, Bill? So, yeah. So, but I don't think you have as many as this, right? So that's there. And if you're lucky, you're the one who is the high bidder. And you get to take the thing home that you've been bidding on nervously or waiting for it to come up. So here's again a view of the dial of the clock that said Rufus Porter on it. And the thing to remember here is that, like most clocks of this time period, Rufus Porter did not make the clock case. That's made out of cherry. It would have been made by a cabinet maker. Rufus Porter did not paint the dial. That's a kind of a standard kind of dial. He wasn't a dial painter and he wouldn't have done it and it wouldn't have looked like that. Rufus Porter worked on and played with, as I was excited to find out, was the clock movement. And I ended up writing an article about it in our Collector magazine because it had very distinctive things that kind of got me and other people excited who were clock people. So this is the front of the movement once the dial is off. And this does have Rufus Porter's DNA on it. But not only does it, and it has some distinctive things which are interesting because it makes me believe that Rufus Porter actually worked on this. He didn't just buy a clock and tell the dial painter to put his name on it. He actually was playing around with this, and it's documented. He has in his own hand, he's written things about how he was very interested in clocks and working on things to try to make them better as he was tinkering with them. These little cutouts are quite distinctive and unusual. But if you look up here, there's a little stamp. And we can see more that that's actually his stamp. And you say, well, that's backwards. But it's quite easy when you're creating a punch to reverse the letters by accident too. And there is no PR clockmaker from this period. Paul Revere did not make clocks. So I'm convinced that this is the stamp of Rufus Porter. And we also have this comparing it to his one of his few known signatures, and we see that the letters look quite similar too. So for those kinds of reasons, both his name on it. So my conjecture is that this was a clock. He worked on the movement with another clockmaker, got some parts, put them together, did some innovative things, stamped the movement like that. And this was the clock that was probably in his house in Billerica until his wife passed away at age 54. So this is one view of the movement. A few distinctive things too. These pillars that connect the two plates, very unusual. This shape is not common at all. The pillars are actually screwed into the plates, which is also unusual. Usually they poke through with just a pin that was holding them in place. And this is, I of course took it apart to service it, but also to document it. So there's other sort of weird stuff happening too, including one drum has grooves to keep the weight cords in the right place, but the other one is smooth. So this makes you think that he was sort of piecing things together. You know, these wheels look different, as if he was, he had parts, again, probably working with the clockmaker to put some innovative things into a clock movement that he then had in his house. This may be one of the most unusual, and this also shows us that these were not stock parts, because this is the tube that the hour hand mounts on here. And these casting occlusions, if this had come out as kind of a professional clockmaking establishment, these occlusions that would happen from casting this piece wouldn't have been there. That would have been rejected. But the other thing is you see these bevels on here. And it's sort of hard to explain, but this allows the clock hands to be set backwards without breaking anything, because it's a little finger that kind of rides on these. And normally this is just a squared off step. So if you try to go backwards, the little finger jams against the step and can actually break if you try to move the hands backwards. But with this bevel here and a more exaggerated bevel here, you can go backwards and the little finger kind of rides up on that step instead of jamming and breaking or bending. And I've not seen that kind of bevel on the step here on any other snail. This is called the snail on any other. So I think that was one thing that he was playing with at the time too. He had more than 24 patents for mechanical inventions. And I don't think he ever patented this. I got excited at first because I said, oh, well, this is a striking part of the clock, and the date of issue was 1832, which is about when this clock is from. So I think, well, that's good. Let me go find this patent and I'll see if it relates to that. And there's the patent office around that time in 1832. In 1836, the patent office burned to the ground. 10,000, what is this? 10,000 patents, everything in it burnt up. So there's no way for us to know, unless by accident something got out of the patent office before 1836. There's no way of knowing what these patents were before 1836. So there was no way that I could find out what that early patent was that was listed for Rufus Porter. It might have been for something he did with his clock, but we don't know. You think they would have bought a fire extinguisher in 1837, but in 1877, the place burned down a second time, destroying the drawings and models that were in there again. So I think now they have a fire extinguisher at the patent office, but they needed one before all this. So again, we lost a lot of these patent models and drawings that would have told us a lot about history. But this is one of, and sort of ironically, this is one of the Rufus Porter inventions, his patent drawing, and it's a fire alarm thing. So if they'd had that in the patent office, they might have saved the stuff too. But it's kind of innovative because this is sort of like an alarm movement in a Connecticut clock. That when the time came, this would turn around and this hammer would bang against this bell and wake you up if you'd set it on your early kitchen clock or parlor clock from Connecticut. But what this did was this had kind of an expandable a brass piece underneath, and if this heated up from a fire right under this thing, it would expand in a way that would trip the alarm as well. So it was kind of an interesting patent concept, and maybe he had some experience, I guess, with Scientific American burning down too. He was thinking about fire stuff a lot. I thought, well, maybe here's another one, because in another newspaper kind of similar to what he was producing, the New England Artisan, there's one of his patents which is documented here. So here it's improvement of clocks by Rufus Porter, Billerica. So even though he was wandering around a lot, his home base was Billerica, and that's where the town was. So I thought, oh, this might be it, but this actually has nothing to do with that strike system of keeping the hands from, allowing the hands to be backward. This is a mechanism that would actually not only ring an alarm, but light a candle when you wanted to wake up. And this kind of clock was actually produced about 50 years later. I don't know if anybody produced it at the time of Porter's patent, but the Ansonia Clock Company about 50 years later made this. So it would happen not only with the alarm ring, but this little arm would swing over, scratch against that, and light the candle. But what I'm thinking is that that match probably half the time flew out of its holder and caught the curtains on fire. So you sure would wake up, I guess, when your bedroom was on fire. But I don't know if it was a practical idea, but I've seen these at auction, and I guess the ones we can still buy are the ones that didn't burn the house down and the match stayed where it belonged. But so that was kind of interesting. So he had a concept essentially for an automobile, but a steam powered car. So this is from 1845, his steam carriage. So again, way before Henry Ford, but he had the idea of having a steam engine mounted on there that can go along the road. So I thought, wow, this is pretty innovative for 1845, until I was in Paris in the Museum of Art and Métier. And this is actually from the 1770s. So somebody in France actually designed kind of a steam road vehicle 50 years before, or 70 years before Rufus Porter did. I don't think I wanted to be the guy driving this or behind it on 93, but they did exist back then. And of course, the Stanley steamer is what sort of commercialized the process. And this is, you see, there is sort of, again, that big tea kettle is under the hood of a Stanley steamer, and they were great cars at the time too. Quiet, fast. You had to wait about 20 minutes till you got steam before you could pull out of your driveway. But once they were making steam, they were great vehicles. So he also had an idea for the bullet engine. So this is kind of a variation of the patent that he sold to Samuel Colt, but this was really the predecessor to something else. But my friend and I, when a guy who was working with me doing clock repair at the time, he also did some graphic design, and he thought we should actually come out with a line of Rufus Porter beers and ale, and this was the first prototype, was the bullet engine IPA. But we haven't done that yet. I won't be serving it here later, but it's an idea that we're working on. But it really, again, was the predecessor to the Gatling gun. It had kind of the same notion of a revolving barrel, so you didn't just load once and then, get killed while you were loading the next shot. So this would fire a lot of bullets at once. So up at an old historic Deerfield, we have a great museum there, and this is another one of Rufus Porter's patented objects, but this one was actually made and commercialized. This is a corn sheller. So if you were cranking the wheel here and sticking the corn cob in there with the corn on it, it would, I guess at least theoretically, strip the corn kernels off of the cob. I've never seen one of these work, but apparently enough of them were made in order for him to have one there too. So this is another excerpt from one of my Wesley McNair poems, because another one of the things he was known almost most for was designing a Zeppelin, a blimp. And supposedly his motivation for it was he wanted to rescue Napoleon from where he had been exiled. He was a fan of Napoleon, and he wanted to fly this blimp there and pluck Napoleon off the island and bring him back. But he also had the idea of using this as a quick way to get to the California gold rush. So here he is, his aerial transport, and we see this is, he spent decades trying to promote this. He actually made working models that flew around in Washington. He showed it to members of Congress trying to get subsidies to do this, because at this point, a fast trip to the gold fields was still 3 months, either around the Horn or across Panama. And he said that you could get to California in 3 days on this. So he had this was a hydrogen-filled dirigible. This was a cabin below that could hold up to 100 customers. It had pontoons in case you landed on water, you wouldn't drown. They would serve meals on it, and there was a steam engine that actually turned a propeller. Whether you wanted a steam engine blowing a lot of sparks up into a hydrogen-filled bag, maybe wasn't a good idea, but it never got commercialized. But he spent a lot of his later life trying to promote this. This was the best route to the aerial locomotive, it's called, R. Porter. Then he sold shares in this company. There's a $5 share, number 674, where people were investing in it. And, he just essentially was ahead of his time. It was a concept that probably was workable, maybe not quite in the form that he did it, but it was something that he worked hard on. And back in the collection of books on the table, those are all my books that I brought in. There is a reproduction again of the little booklet that he produced about this that tells you much more about this. This plant, he even produced this newspaper. Let's see, I think I have one here. Yeah, the aerial reporter. This is a facsimile of the aerial reporter that he put this out periodically, again, to try to keep interest going in that kind of thing. And I'm realizing too that what I forgot to show you when I came here, I don't know if people came here because they're football fans, because Rufus Porter played for the Seattle Seahawks. And if anyone was thinking this was going to be a talk about NFL football, I'm sorry if I've disappointed you, but this is not the Rufus Porter that I'm speaking about today. So, nor do I think he's a descendant. So, for obvious reasons. So there's the aerial reporter, and again, they eventually led to these big blimp Zeppelins. This is an American one. The American Air Force certainly built a number of these too, and thought that they were a good idea for a while. So I mentioned the exhibit at the Bodenkopf Museum of Art. This is a view of the museum. And they produced a wonderful exhibit and an accompanying book, which you can read back there. And I have a second copy, which I've donated to the Salem Athenaeum. So if you want to read a lot about Rufus Porter, come and check that book out, because it tells much more of the story than I've been able to tell you here today. These were the two curators that did a great job with that exhibit. And this was, again, an exhibit of some of the portrait miniatures. I think they all passed Deb Child's muster. They all have the right shaped ear. So those were on display here too. And I wrote a review of the book and of the exhibit for Maine Antique Digest, and showing some of the things that I've talked about today in that article. So these are the two curators, Linda Sprague and Justin Wolfe, standing there with my clock. And I owned the clock. Linda came down to the house to look at it and said, yeah, we definitely want this. It's the only known clock with Rufus Porter's name on it. And it has a great story because of those innovations in the movement. So again, it was an important part of the exhibit. And these are the two curators that were happy to have it. And I realized that at some point that the clock really belonged at the Rufus Porter Museum. I'd already been there. I'd done a couple of talks there in the past, and it seemed like it shouldn't be in my foyer anymore. It should be up there where people who really want to learn a lot about Rufus Porter and see it should do it. So that clock is now at the Rufus Porter Museum. I delivered it there, and they just were extremely happy to have it. And I guess Diane saw it there and agrees that it's in the right place, right? So, yeah, so that made me feel good. So there's the entrance to the Porter Museum. It's a great place to visit. As she will confirm as well, there's a view of the place. They have expansion plans too, because there's certainly more that they could fit in there about the story. And they have a great way for anybody to be Rufus Porter. So I thought this was a fun thing to do too. There's one of Jean too with a woman Rufus Porter, but I'm not embarrassing her by showing that one. But that's a great thing where I too can be Rufus Porter. This is kind of the sad thing, because this was in the newspaper a day or two after he died, and the title is "Few Present," and we see here again very few present at the service. He just was so old, and he was known to some of the people there in Connecticut where he was living at the time. But very few. But he was healthy, like right up to a few days before he passed away, even in his 80s. He walked 17 miles a day. He'd spend all day and night down in his shop with his lathe making stuff. So it wasn't a sad story, except just right at the end where he got something bad and died within a couple of days, and there weren't many at the funeral. But as we know, because I'm standing here and now you see all those books, he's not been forgotten. There's another book that's about the murals by these women who are very interested in decorative wall painting in New England. There's Jean Lippman's book that I mentioned. There's a sequel that Jean Lippman did with new material about Rufus Porter. But I'll take the last few minutes to talk about Salem, because I don't have a Rufus Porter connection to Salem, except that there's a record that in a couple of the classes he was teaching, two guys walked from Salem to Billerica in order to take some painting classes with him. But a project of mine that I hope I'll be back to talk about in a couple of years is about the Mulliken family of clockmakers in New England. And some of them worked here in Salem, including Samuel Mulliken. And my collaborator on this book is Damon DeMoro, my friend, who's sitting back there. So the two of us will be back here in a couple of years to do the Dog and Pony Show after our book is produced. It'll be published by the Concord Museum in Concord, Mass. too. So again, this is just sort of a mock-up of the cover that we're hoping to produce. There's one of the ads that Samuel Mulliken produced in the late 1700s as he was working right around here and right opposite where Reverend Prince was preaching. So this is, we have a lot of documentation of Samuel Mulliken at work here in Salem. You can see he got a few new watches in. I guess that's some, try to get you motivated to come buy them before they sell out. So he's just gotten them in from London. And as Damon discovered, and I've then explored, there's an account book of Samuel Mulliken's that's at the Phillips Library, the PBS Essex Museum Library archive in Rowley. And we both spent some time going through that. These are some of the entries. Luckily, his handwriting was pretty good. So we're able to see what he was charging and the kind of work he was doing. Not only he has a French watch he was repairing, but and here's what he was charging for things. But in this small clock, I started to think about what could that be? What would that small clock be? Because it wouldn't be a tall clock, obviously. And it could have been a small clock like this, which is a unbelievably beautiful, rare dwarf clock that's at the PBS Essex Museum. You can see it just a few steps from here. And this only stands about 3 feet tall. So it's possible that this is the kind of small clock he was talking about that he was making and selling at that time. This is his brother also worked here and worked for him and with him. And his account book is up there too, which Damon and I have also explored. And he was doing work for Reverend Prince. So you can see he was working on things for Reverend Prince's air pump, which was one of the famous machines that Reverend Prince made. He also was working on his microscope, an interesting spelling there, and a roasting jack and a timepiece. So this was all work that was being done for at that time. This is the air pump. The Bowdoin College Museum of Art I just mentioned owns one of Reverend Prince's air pump. These were things that were used in scientific experiments where they have it under a bell jar and they could take the air out. And if the bird inside died, they say, oh yeah, I guess birds need air in order to live. So it was, that kind of experimentation, but it was things where they could create a vacuum by pumping. And Reverend Prince made these beautiful, innovative and functional air pumps. And we now know that the Mullikens were working on parts for those clocks and helping him make those air pumps. There's an image of Reverend John Prince, a great, interesting guy for a lot of reasons. Probably some of you at least know about his importance here in Salem. This is a roasting jack that you saw where he was making and selling roasting jacks. These were hung by the fireplace, and that's what turned the meat as it was cooking in the open hearth. Because otherwise, the servant girl or boy was getting their eyebrows burnt off. Well, it sounds like our time is up here, so I don't think we're near the last slides. But so this is a roasting jack, and those were popular and common, again, to hang by the fireplace so that the meat automatically turned and either the wife or the servant wasn't there getting scorched or catching on fire while the meat was turning. So, and the other thing that you saw on that list was a timepiece. And a timepiece is really the correct name for a clock that doesn't strike the hours. If it only ticks and tells time, at least theoretically, it's not a clock, it's a timepiece. So when he lists timepiece in there, he's talking about things that didn't strike, they just told the time. And this is an example, possibly by Samuel Mulliken II. And that's, we think, because this is quite distinctive. So this was, again, a little short clock, maybe 3 feet tall, and just a timepiece. It didn't do any striking. So we can conjecture that perhaps that's the timepiece that he's talking about in that ledger where he was making and repairing them. So getting back to Rufus Porter for the final image, you can see that he has resurfaced. He's in our minds and hearts now too. We increasingly appreciate both his art and his mechanical innovations and his being a Yankee polymath, a Yankee innovator, kind of the kind of person that made New England an industrial revolution, kind of what it was, that kind of polymath, innovator, mechanic, teacher, educator, and even as we see back here, some years ago now, his artwork was on the cover of Antiques magazine. So we know that he's not forgotten, and he's now appreciated by us in this room and many other people too. So thank you for listening and coming. If you'd like to, if you want to hand this around, because this really is best appreciated up close. So, and then we know who it is, but I don't think he was anybody famous. I probably don't need to pass around Rufus Porter here, but if anyone wants to see him, you can. So, and the other thing I discovered today when it was too late to add any more pictures was that in Cambridge on Church Street for several years, there was a Rufus Porter restaurant. And in the restaurant were murals that had been saved from a house that had been torn down in Westford. So it was, I'm sorry, I didn't know about it in 1960 or whenever this was, but there was a restaurant with his murals in there. And there's even explanatory things on the menu about who he was and the fact of how happy they were to have his full-size murals, like you saw at the Museum of Fine Arts, were in the walls of this restaurant on Church Street in Cambridge some years ago. So questions, yes?
I actually have a question. So I'm not sure if this is your avenue of expertise, but he was able to do these murals in a short period of time. One reason for that is because of the things he used to eat with. Could you talk about that? I'm thinking specifically of corn cob for trees.
Well, and he does in those, both in his newspapers later and in that earlier book, he talks about all the ways of doing this quickly and effectively. Where he said, if you like lean on the side of the brush, you can do a line here. And yeah, if you just, sort of pat with something, suddenly it's a tree, and it looks great. So I think again, that Yankee innovator, he figured out the way to do this stuff quickly, so it wasn't all just stencils, but he had and the details just for the answer in more detail that you're asking about are in that magazine, or in his, his own words describing how he did these quick images like that too. So it, it's sort of the opposite, of the Dutch, guys that had one hair on their brush, and it would take them a month to do the hand, So this was, he was trying to get in and get out, but very effectively too. I think those images are beautiful. So I don't know why I ended up with this picture on there again, but this one, doesn't this get everyone excited? Yeah, look at those holes, right? I'm sorry.
Someone blinds clocks all the time, and that is exciting.
Oh, okay, good. Well, let's see. There's the PR, right? So, any other questions before we eat all the cookies? All right. Well, again, thank you all for coming, and I hope you check out the book I donated and read even more about Rufus Porter.